Hello and most welcome to 2031. We will today continue with, let's see, this article by Terry Marks-Tarlow. See if we can find it over here. That's the one. Synchronicity, a causal connection and the fractal dynamics of clinical practice. Last time we mentioned that fractal epistemology is an opening for a wider understanding of the depth and how things comes to stem into, and how that depth is equal or at least very similar to the interpenetrative depth of the self-penetration. That means going into the very same, go into itself. And we had a lovely depiction in the previous paper about fractal geometry as a bridge between realms, also by Terry Marks-Tarlow. Terry Marks-Tarlow. We will continue now, as I mentioned, about synchronicity, acausal connections. Last time, very briefly, 2030, we were looking how the fractal epistemology sets as a framework for modeling complex psychological boundaries between self and other and self and world that display seemingly paradoxical qualities of both separating and uniting these domains. Uniting these domains. We use clinical cases to highlight the value of fractals. And now I'm continuing on the second paragraph of page 469. 469 for modeling relational patterns, including unconscious sharing, before turning to a clinical example involving synchronicity. We introduce the term transsubjective to indicate a realm beyond subjectivity and intersubjectivity that transcends internal experience to include elements of the external world. The external world, they go hand in hand and interpenetrate. They go hand in hand and interpenetrate. Toward this end, we present a theory of interobjectivity interobjectivity. The transsubjective striving to share and understand material and informational realms of existence. All of those and none of those. All of those and none of those. We conclude by highlighting the role of acausal connections within fractal patterns of reality and experience. Experience. New metaphors emerging. New metaphors emerging. How psychoanalysts conceive work with patients is intimately connected with the metaphors and models we use. We use. As Daniel Stern suggested, central metaphors lurk at the narrative origins of understanding ourselves and others. Benjamin Wolstein asserted that central metaphors also underlie the narrative origins of clinical theory. Within the field of psychoanalysis, Wolstein traced an evolution from one person intrapsychic metaphors to two-person intersubjective ones. Intersubjective ones. From the therapist functioning as blank screens, neutral interpreters, to participant observers, and finally co-participant with the shared therapist-patient relationship. The relationship. Wilner warned against embracing static, reified metaphors that either bolster defensive operations or unduly constrain authentic encounters. Authentic encounters. Authentic encounters. Woolstein's progression of analytic metaphors gets increasingly dynamic, open-ended, and non-linear, while moving ever closer to the participant's lived experience. Marks-Tarlow highlighted the inherently non-linear nature of metaphor itself. For even the most reified metaphor does not comprise a single line of reasoning, instead remaining open to interpretation by fanning out in multiple directions. She asserted that the very process of creating metaphors is self-referential, ever shifting between pointing inwards toward the self as the imaginative author of experience and outwards towards toward the world as the primary source of creative inspiration, the creative inspiration, how we get inspired and how we learn from that inspiration. The all-important, ever-advancing, inspirative force, the inspirational force. The inspirational force. As we shall explain shortly, the recursive fractal patterns capture much of what surrounds us in nature, both outside and inside our bodies, whether in space or in time. The branching patterns of trees, rivers, blood vessels, and synaptic connections in the brain, the fluffiness of clouds, jaggedness of coastline, the coastline of Norway, irregularities of the heartbeat, patterns of behavior and population growth, and the very nature of self-reflection and relational dynamics that shift flexibly with the perspective of the observer, of the observer. The importance of self-referential patterning in psychoanalytic theory was anticipated by Robert Stolorow, an original proponent of intersubjectivity and nonlinear dynamics for modeling patient-therapist interactions. Interactions! He first suggested that the observer is the observed. In his doctoral thesis, Phases in the Clouds, which linked the theories of Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, and Otto Rank to the personal histories of these founding figures of psychoanalytic theory. While Stolorow did not use the term self-reference, he anticipated the recursive symmetry of fractal geometry by highlighting the self-referential significance of inner resonance during innovation in creative giants. Giants! Whether consciously or not, clinical metaphors are often borrowed from science. From science. This paper concentrates on fractal metaphors and models for describing relational patterning, including their application to the uncanny. The term first introduced by Freud to describe extrasensory knowing in psychoanalysis. Such as apparent telepathy and precognition in patient-therapist interaction. Interaction. One goal of this paper is to bring uncanny and extrasensory forms of knowing out of the shadows and squarely into the domain of natural and clinical sciences, where they can be used to construct a non-reductive naturalistic framework with the potential to deepen and enrich the process of therapeutic interaction. Interaction. a non-reductive approach, a non-reductive approach. We offer a fractal epistemology approach to counteract both the reluctant position of ignoring the emergent complexity of higher psychological processes in favor of conservative neuroscience, and the equally reductive anti-materialist trend of privileging subjectivity at the expense of external reality. Which restricts clinical attention solely to the intersubjective matrix of transference counter transference dynamics. While reductive neuroscience privileges downward reduction of mind to brain, exclusive focus on subjectivity in psychoanalysis perpetuates the upward reduction by omitting wider physiological and physical reality. Reality. The steady infiltration of interpersonal neurobiology into the psychoanalytic field introduces the significance of integrating the material levels of brain and body in relational dynamics. Relational dynamics. Likewise, nonlinear dynamical applications highlight the centrality of systemic thinking within a unity of processes, from psychological to material, and from micro to macro levels. From micro to macro levels. Levels. Why the field model of Gestalt thinkers epitomized by Kurt Lewin and phenomenologists such as Merleau-Ponty offers an incipient framing for complex unity, This paper strives toward a more contemporary, integrative framework. Specifically, we suggest that the recursive patterns of fractal geometry are integral to patterns of relatedness, a phrase so commonly found within the psychoanalytic literature. The psychoanalytic literature. The psychoanalytic literature. An identification of self-similar themes facilitates deep work with core dynamics, central metaphors, and organizing schemas. Facilitates deep work, schemas, facilitating insight and more adaptive choices in self-other relatedness. A phrase so commonly found within the psychoanalytic literature. The psychoanalytic literature, a psychoanalytic literature. An identification of self-similar themes facilitates deep work with core dynamics, central metaphors, and organizing schemas, facilitating insight and more adaptive choices in self-other relatedness. We suggest that the degree to which self-similar resonances fan out beyond the therapist-patient relationship and into the world at large may both manifest and facilitate readiness for change. Such mutative potential of fractal patterns directly relates to Donald Stern's notion of relational freedom, the most open state of the analytic relationship that allows for the emergence of new dimensions and templates of relatedness. Templates of relatedness. Fractals arise in the spaces between, in between. Contemporary psychoanalysis shifts attention away from the exclusive intrapsychic realms as if existing in a vacuum to the spaces between people as zones of relational transaction. Relational transaction. British object relations psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott introduced the terms transitional space objects to represent complex boundary zones negotiated through the joint projection of meaning. Meaning. Meaning, transitional zones are paradoxical in nature, belonging to neither person but partaking of both participants with emergent spaces of creative potential. Creative potential. Psychoanalytic thinkers following in Winnicott's footsteps include Philip Brumberg, who suggested that the analyst must stand in the spaces between multiple self-states of consciousness for healing to occur, and Stuart Pizer, who tackled the negotiation of paradox in the analytic process. In the analytic process. Just as intersubjectivity self-organizes to emerge in the fertile transitional space between people, fractal patterns self-organize to emerge in the infinite space between ordinary finite Euclidean dimensions. Euclidean dimensions. Benoit Mandelbrot considered the theory the bevy of recursively enfolded shapes as the centerfold of his fractal geometry of nature. Which has the capacity to describe natural phenomena previously considered too irregular, complex, or discontinuous to model successfully. To model successfully. Marks-Tarlow illustrated how recursive properties of self-similarity and scale invariance relate to transference dynamics in the clinical case of a middle-aged divorced mother of two, named Sue. Named Sue. One day, his ordinarily punctual patient forgot to turn the light in the waiting room. Sue was left waiting until, upon a hunch, her therapist opened the door. As the two sat down, Marks-Tarlow inquired whether Sue was experiencing invisibility issues in slightly ironic tone. Ironic tone! Ironic tone. Ironic tone. Sue responded that while in the waiting room, she had been musing upon a dream from the night before, where she struggled mightily to catch the eye of her boss. A glass wall separated the two of them, and despite frantically waving in his direction and the boss turning toward her, he seemed to look right through Sue. It rhymes! Right through her, Sue. As therapist and patient dug deeper in this issue of invisibility, they uncovered layer after layer of self-similar issues. Sue was the unseen child of a narcissistic mother and later the unseen wife of a narcissistic husband. A narcissistic husband. Then for decades following her divorce, her primary identity had rested lovingly upon caretaking her children. Her children. But her children were now older and recently flown the nest, no longer needing her in the same way. In the same way. Sue's invisibility incident fanned out to include her boss, her children, her own sense of self, as well as transference dynamics with her therapist. Here, here, we see the operation of scale invariance in a way a core issue extends from a tiny scale, forgetting to flip a light switch, through the intermediate scale of a night's dream to the lifelong scale of personal identity across the patient's lifespan. Meanwhile, the here and now enactment within transference dynamics facilitated the uncovering of multiple levels of meaning, of meaning, of meaning. Such that invisibility became the central metaphor illuminating the way forward for the duration of Sue's psychotherapy. And there we put an end to 2031. Let's go to some quote. Just a short note here on page 470. And how we often reduce either the subjective realm to say that it doesn't have an importance. It could be reduced to the matter that makes up the mind. And we ignore the complexity of higher psychological processes we see in the second paragraph of page 470, or third. underneath the subtitle A Non-Reductive Approach. But the equally bad, the anti-materialist trend of privileging subjectivity at the expense of external reality. Idealism, Bernardo Kastrup, people who deny reality, postmodernism, that opposite trend is very equal. It's the mirror image of the taking away of the observer, which is often called within quantum mechanics. Page 471. 471. Fractals arise in the spaces between. Can you see the similarity here? I just mentioned that it is neither completely reductionist nor is it highly idealistic, the opposite. It is in between. Neither is it a compromise, that it is you go halfway. No, it's either or and also, both, and none of them. And this is why fractality is here so helpful for us to understand the relation between space and object, between subject, the observer, and what is observed. It is in the, as I often call, the liminal zone in between, where everything happens, where everything stems into existence. Where everything becomes possible. Where everything spring into existence in the liminal zone, not in either zone, not the coastline in its stone way or the water. It is not the fixity of an object, let's say stone, nor is it the surrounding negative space. It is both, either or, and everything happens in the liminal zone. Those things is called, according to Julian Barber and much of others, shape universe. Shapes are not scale affected by scale. A shape is a shape, and it is the shapes that we use. It's not the kilograms or the meters or the kilometers, if you like. We are completely dependent on the shapes. What shape is it? And fractality is but shape, and shape starts only in the liminal zone. That does not mean that the existence of firmity or stone-likeness is unimportant, nor the negative space. We need to keep more things in play. It is very similar to juggling. It is not about reducing away something. You need to be able to juggle your way. Juggle your way. To go into it, to further it, to make it more vivid, more complex. All about shapes, and then you also understand why it is so important with the liminal zone. because it is exactly in the liminal zone there where everything exists. So shape before things that are size dependent. And this needs to be transferred also to time. It is not time as minutes, hours, but it is in the betweenness. The distinctions, the lines we draw. I think you be better remember Kaufman here. I will check out the paper by Kaufman Varela. But Kaufman is pointing to distinction as being the most important feature. Distinction is very similar to the liminal zone, and that we need to focus on shape, not some excluding idea of a form in the sense of mass or existence in that very limited way. No, open up the shapes, make them fractal, that is translucent. When they become translucent, they could also be more malleable. You can enter them and you can make new distinctions. So shape should not be seen as something static in that way. The staticness, the tension, the lack of energy that you usually find in the either or situation can now be transcended, opened up, shown to be something greater, more pertinent, more deciding. And of course, much more, even more fruitful. Well, I think I end there. I thank you very much for participating. Let's see where I ended exactly on page 471. Thank you for joining, everyone. Have a very beautiful morning, day, or afternoon. Bye-bye for now.